My name is Spyros Economides, and I'm an associate professor in international relations at the LSE. And I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is entitled Crisis in Central and Eastern Europe ? Today's event is hosted by LSE Ideas, the LSE's foreign policy think tank, in conjunction with the Radu Democracy Center of the Radu Family Charitable Foundation, and we're very happy to have their sponsorship for this event. And in fact, this event is the first of a series of seminars entitled the Radu Dialogue on Democracy, which is a series of public dialogues and knowledge sharing events to promote liberal democracy across Central and Southeastern Europe. The theme of today's panel is incredibly topical and incredibly important. The title, Crisis in Central and Eastern Europe, has a question mark at the end of it, which suggests that there may be debate as to whether there is a crisis indeed, and something worth discussing. Our second question, which could be covered, is what type of a crisis is this? Is this a crisis, strictly speaking, to do with populism? How does a liberal democracy and our understanding of it fit into this particular debate? And last but not least, is the question of, is this kind of crisis or these kinds of crises exclusive to Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe, or is it part of a broader phenomenon across Europe and beyond? To help us get to grips with some of these ideas and questions and topics, we have a very eminent panel made up of 3 academics representing the region from different academic perspectives. Our first speaker will be Arkadiusz Nyzio, who holds a PhD from the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, where he is currently assistant professor in the Department of National Security. Next month, his new book on a study of the transformation of the internal security apparatus of Poland 1989 to 1993 will be published. Arkadiusz is extremely knowledgeable, of course, on the political scene in Poland in contemporary terms. He will be concentrating his comments mainly on Poland, but he will be addressing the crisis in the region as a region beyond the confines of Poland itself. Our second speaker is Radu Albu-Comănescu. He's a lecturer in the Faculty of European Studies at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj, and he's also a member of the European Research Institute there. He is also a member of the executive board of the Radu Democracy Center, which is sponsoring these series. And he frequently writes for Ziua de Cluj, Romania's largest regional newspaper. Last but not least in our panel of speakers is my friend Slobodan Markovich, who's a full professor in the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade, where he also heads the Center for British Studies. Currently, Slobodan is writing on a history of European pessimism. Now, our speakers have agreed to keep their comments to about 10 minutes each. This will enable us to then enter into a Q&A session, which will allow our many participants from around Europe and beyond to put the questions they want to our eminent panel. This event is being recorded and will be podcast. It is also being webcast live on the LSE website. And for those of you who wish to tweet, the hashtag of the event is #RatuDialogues. Without further ado, I would like to invite Arkadiusz Nyzio to commence the proceedings by speaking on Poland and the region from his perspective. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. There's a lot of things to cover. For now, I have 5 points I'd like to make, and a couple of others and some details perhaps I could elaborate later on and during the Q&A. So firstly, I'd like to put our subject in a context. The title of our meeting is a crisis in Central and Eastern Europe with a question mark. And in the description, there's another important question. Can liberal democracy survive? I think that although this region has its specifics, in this context, it's not that far from Western Europe or other parts of the world. Globally, this is a very bad time for democracy. The whole democratic world is struggling with similar problems. And so, yes, I do believe that there is a crisis in this part of Europe, but I think that the issue is wider. Secondly, there are similarities, of course, but each case is different. And for example, a lot of people argue that situation in Poland and Hungary is very similar. And it's true that the Polish officials are very eager to demonstrate what a huge inspiration Viktor Orban is to them. But although we can clearly see the resemblance in some areas, I think that Poland is still very far from turning into another Hungary. The differences are striking. Things like dealing with the private Central European University in Budapest didn't happen in Poland. Almost total monopolization of media didn't happen in Poland. Getting rid of the opposition using various dirty techniques didn't happen in Poland. The opposition is operating normally, more or less. Some people argue that the ruling parties are using the government machinery against the opposition, but really this is nothing new. Current opposition, where it was in power, was using similar methods. Perhaps it was smaller in scale, and perhaps they were less unceremonious about it, but still, our elections are still considered free. Hungary is the first and only EU member state to be considered partially free by the Freedom House, and Poland remains free. The similarities are apparent in the narrative, in the symbolic sphere, like identity politics, looking for the enemy of the state, a skepticism or even hatred towards minorities, for example, the infamous LGBT ideology free zones, and some heavy-handed propaganda. It's true. But also the Hungarian government was an inspiration in a couple of initiatives in Poland, like, for example, the supermarket tax. But I'd say that in the institutional sense, there is hardly any resemblance. Thirdly, I do not think that Poland is in danger, as of now, of transforming into an authoritarian, totalitarian or hybrid regime, at least not in a foreseeable future and not under this leadership. Having said that, I'd like to emphasize I'm no optimist. I'm simply afraid of something else, chaos. That would be my interpretation. So not the rule of the people, which is democracy, not the rule of the few, which is autocracy, but chaocracy, if you will, which is the rule of chaos. If we were to judge the situation in Poland in recent years on the basis of the public discourse alone, then the interpretation would be clear. This is not a liberal democracy, you'd say. And it looks that way, of course, but it's more complicated than that. A lot of people think that we have this new power which dictates the rules. And I think what we are currently facing is the slow dismantling of rules. And I don't like the term illiberal democracy, partially because I'm waiting for political scientists to carefully define what it is. I'm not convinced by the most famous interpretation by Farid Zakaria. I think it's hard to define this phenomenon because it's constantly changing. For example, in the sense of using more and more sophisticated methods of targeting the electorate. And one other thing which bothers me is the finality of the term. If we were to apply this term to the situation in Poland, it would mean that this liberal political and cultural substance was replaced by some other illiberal substance. And there have been changes, sure, but if you take a look at the private media, NGOs, universities, social media, local governments, then it would be clear that there is a struggle which is very far from being over. And I don't necessarily think that this illiberal side of the struggle is winning. I'd say that as of now, it's a draw. The rules of liberal democracy weren't, at least not yet, replaced by some other illiberal rules, but rather by the lack of rules, by chaos, coincidences, and spontaneous order. Fourthly, what the Law and Justice and its junior coalition parties have been doing since 2015 is a kind of institutional, they started kind of institutional disease, and the disease is spreading. And the rule of chaos is the most apparent in the judiciary, obviously. And as you know, in December 2017, the European Commission for the first time triggered the Article 7 procedure regarding the rule of law. And the procedure is still in place. Probably it will end with nothing, but it shows how big the problem is. And I could talk about it for a while, maybe later I could elaborate. But let me give you an example on how this disease works. It all started with an attempt to take over the Constitutional Tribunal, which is the Constitutional Court of Poland, in 2015. After a lot of struggle, it would seem that the ruling parties succeeded, but it didn't stop there. Because the parliament passed some controversial legislation, like, for example, the so-called Surveillance Act, or, for example, the Anti-Terrorist Act. And in cases like this, the Polish ombudsman could ask the court to check if the past legislation is in accordance with the constitution. And this is what he did. But because of this personal and structural changes in the tribunal, he changed his mind and withdrew his motions. And he did it not because he suddenly felt that the law is fine, but because he realized that probably the court's verdict will suit the ruling parties. So, because he thought that the verdict will not be meritocratic due to the court's political inclination, he himself was in a way forced to act in a non-meritocratic way. And this is how it goes. This is how it spreads. The different institutions which should be separated from politics, well, not entirely, but from day-to-day political competition, are being forced to take part in the competition and kind of choose a side. And then, of course, automatically, the other side assumes that this institution cannot be trusted. And the issue of trust is a crucial one. I will be happy to elaborate on it later. Fifthly, it is not exactly true that the government succeeded in taking over those institutions. That the willpower of the government and the ruling parties in Poland is significantly weaker than, for an example, Hungary, because the institutional environment resists. These so-called captured institutions are neither reformed, because clearly they are not working any better, nor completely obedient. Rather, they are paralyzed in a way. For example, out of 15 judges of the Constitutional Tribunal, 14 were appointed after the change of power in 2015. So it should be undisputed who holds the court. But we have many reasons to believe that there is an internal struggle, and even the judges appointed by the current coalition are not necessarily bound by its will. For example, it is unclear what will be the verdict on the controversial law which lowered the pensions of the communist security apparatus functionaries. And so the issue remains unresolved. A president of the court is not certain if the judges would vote accordingly to the will of the ruling parties. So she's trying to stall. And we'll see in October when the hearing is to take place, but perhaps it will be moved once again, like it was 6 times already, because they are not certain. The same thing is happening with, for example, the Supreme Audit Office, the Supreme Court, or the National Council of the Judiciary. So, to sum it up, it doesn't look too good. Democracy in Poland will survive, in my opinion, but it's a dangerous path we're heading. We are not necessarily facing a problem of oppressive government, but rather destructive one, institution-wise. I don't believe that the alternation of power will happen anytime soon, and I don't believe that the main opposition party has a clue how to deal with problems I've raised. And unfortunately, some changes seem to be profound and irreversible over the next years or even decades. Some institutions were simply devastated, and I cannot see how they could be repaired. Perhaps sometime in the future, they should be dissolved altogether and created once again in a new form, more concrete in the normal sense and strongly embodied in the public political culture, but it will take years. That's it for now. Thank you very much.
Arkadiusz, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for keeping to the time as well. Could we move on now to Radu Albu-Comănescu, who will give us a view from or of Romania and perhaps of the broader region as a whole. Radu, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, greetings from the second largest country in Central and Eastern Europe, which is not Visegrad, and still is different to put on the map of crisis in Europe, especially in terms of illiberal ideas. I'm saying this because listening to what Arkadiusz just said, I'm thinking that what the V4 more or less is going through is, let's say, a technicalities issue. Crisis is conceived in very precise institutional terms, which is not the case necessarily in Romania. Let me start by saying that Romania is not tempted necessarily by illiberalism. It is not tempted by liberalism because in many ways we already lived it. In the when it didn't have this name, in the 1990s and early 2000s, we had presidents who had a quite paternalistic approach of politics in many ways, whose ideas in terms of governance were not exactly compatible with democracy and open society. We have been there, and what's striking is that the civil society in Romania struggled for almost 2 decades to push the course of the country in a place where we are closer to what Visegrad wanted to embody at the beginning of the 1990s, and therefore we almost succeeding in waking up the awareness of the civil society and of the general public, especially the younger generation, that there is a need to keep democracy working and to keep open society values there. However, what's striking in the case of Romania is this sense of nebulousness of the crisis. Every time we confront problems that are originating either from the internal or the external spectrum, we find that they are never alone. They never come alone. They trigger older crises, unhealed wounds, or stir up situations that question deeply the way Romania was governed, is governed, or even worse, who we really are and what we want from our integration in Europe. Integration in Europe meant one thing, and it was mostly a step that is perceived even today as being a bureaucratic one. We integrated in institutional terms. What we need today is convergence, and convergence comes with not just joining, but understanding what's happening in the European Union and questioning this ability of Romania to converge with the real values of the European Union raised questions that classified them into at least 5 categories of crises that we have to handle in Romania. The first will be a political crisis, and political crisis is always related to the quality of the political actors and to their ideas, to the way they relate to the electorate and to the way they relate to the European Union in itself. We have seen political actors being quite tempted at certain points by ideas that were spread in Central and Eastern Europe. And I do recall PSD, the Social Democrats, trying to play along the ideas of Viktor Orban. I'm talking about the president of the Social Democratic Party, Liviu Dragnea, which was arrested last year, and who was very keen to move his political party on a line that is closer to the illiberal one. Before him, I can think of Victor Ponta, was Prime Minister of Romania for a couple of years, who was getting inspired from the Erdogan model. So in those illiberal terms, there is an appeal, but we do not want to, the electorate does not want to embrace those values. Why? We consider that it is safer, and not just safer, but more productive, to keep the society as open as possible and to work towards enrooting democracy and a free market economy. We will see why I'm discussing this in Romania, and I'm discussing about free market and the dangers of controlling it, because we have economic populism. And economic populism comes with the possibility of the government to manipulate more or less the market and to manipulate the economic legislation in terms of taxes, in terms of redistribution of wealth. And this was increasing wages, which was not just the main instrument of keeping the Social Democrats in power for the last 4 years, but also creating by now economic problems that Romania has to confront and the present-day government has to confront. A social crisis comes not only with unsolved post-communist and transition issues, but also with a deep questioning of the civil society, if we are doing the right thing. And we wonder if we are strong enough to create an agenda that brings everyone together around what can be or should be called a country project. We have to know where this country heads. And we've seen in the last public debate surrounding governance and political actors that the civil society is still not there yet. We have good ideas, we have punching ideas, but in terms of creating governance project with viable and sustainable directions, that is something that we need in ways that need a better definition of the instruments that are to be used. Platforms, civic movements, still to define. Institutional and administrative crises, these are older. They come with, once more, with a transition from a centralized state, with a centralized elite, to the decomposition of the old structures, and the permanent recreation of the new ones. We have the feeling sometimes that we act like Sisyphus. And I think this also is valid for countries in Central and Eastern Europe that during the 20th century had to rebuild constantly their societies, their countries, their institutions, political regime and economic regime. And it might reflect a certain, fatigue that impacts on the ability of the civil society to be credible, and needless to say, on the political apparatus to work properly. All wrapped in a moral crisis, because the moral crisis comes with a questioning of values. And in Romania, it came with a questioning about our identity, not just who we were in the past, if we really belong to Europe in ways that can be defined, let's say, without falling into the trap of Samuel Huntington, but how can we be a credible actor in Europe? And this is the question that demoralizes us and needs to be answered. So to conclude more or less, in Romania, we are on a construction site of huge proportions, with many directions to take, with many actors that need better reasoning and better focus, while the political process is still following interests that are keenly related to party politics, sometimes to individuals in political parties. And we are wondering, how are we going to get away from this trap?
Radu, thank you very much indeed. You've raised a series of very interesting questions there, which are particular to Romania, but also raise other cross-national questions, which I think we'll come back to in the discussion later on. But before we start asking those questions, I'd like to ask Slobodan Markovich to share his ideas with us about Serbia and the Western Balkans before we can enter into a fuller dialogue. Slobodan, over to you.
Thank you, Spyros, very much. Allow me at the very beginning to thank LSE Ideas and Radu Democracy Center for organizing this event, and also to thank Radu Democracy Center for organizing Dialogues on Democracy. I will make 4 points. The first point is that in terms of the whole region of the Western Balkans, there is some very specific issue, and these are the 1990s, because during the 1990s, the wars for Yugoslav succession happened. And as a consequence of that, there was a delayed economic transition, a delayed political transition, and a delayed EU prospects. So all the countries of Central Europe made their major advancements in terms of democracy in the 1990s, but the region of the Western Balkans completely skipped that period, and that decade proved to be something that is very, very difficult to compensate. So when finally all the countries of the Western Balkans had democratically elected leaderships in the year of 2000, there were huge expectations in the West. And when also democratic coalition came to power in Belgrade in 2000, there were very, very high expectations, both from the West about the progress of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was the name for Serbia and Montenegro then, and also of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to receive comprehensive aid from the West. But the honeymoon was very short. It perhaps lasted 1 or 2 years and was restricted mainly to the fact that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was readmitted to international institutions, and it got very comprehensive packages of economic aid, and a very burdening question of servicing accumulated foreign debt was also resolved. But what happened very soon was the policy of conditionality. That is where Serbia and some other countries of the Western Balkans faced certain specific issues. And this conditionality included requests made by the West to Serbia that it should resolve its relations with Kosovo, which existed as a special area since 1999, nominally recognized as a part of Serbia, but in reality being governed by essentially by the West, by NATO, and nominally by the UN. The second issue was the issue of regional stability, that Serbia should effectively help regional stability. And the third issue was the issue of the cooperation of Serbia with the International Court Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. So my second point is that this first issue, the Kosovo issue, became a huge problem in the relations of Serbia and the West, and that the issues of Kosovo and Serbian democracy became inseparably linked, probably since 2004, although it wasn't visible immediately, because in the period 2006-2012, when the process of recognition of Kosovo as an independent country gradually began, and Kosovo proclaimed its independence in 2008, which Serbia refused to accept. In that period, 2006-2012, European governments in Washington became increasingly dissatisfied with the responses they were receiving from Belgrade. And therefore, when the parties from the 1990s that were under international isolation, whose leaders were tried at the Hague Tribunal, when they came back to power in Serbia, with a different form, but still continuing having links with the previous parties from the 1990s, when they came back to power in 2012, there was a sense of relief in many Western capitals, and that, of course, is surprising, because it was expected that the Kosovo issue could be resolved now with the full participation of Belgrade. So in 2012 was this great change. That is when Mr. Vučić and his Serbian Progressive Party came to power. And when they came to power, Mr. Vučić took an already well-established system of partitocracy in which political parties basically control everything, absorb major parts of social life. That system was built in the previous 2 decades and even improved further during his rule. So his party currently, by the reports of pro-governmental media, has about 600,000 members. It means that the Serbian Progressive Party with its members, and if we imagine that each member could bring 1 secure vote, has 1.2 million secure votes, and reasonably not more than 3.6 million people could vote in Serbia, or actually vote in Serbia. So if you would imagine a race, 2 sprinters, one representing the opposition and another representing the government sprinter actually, he starts in a race of 1,000 meters, not from the beginning. He has been given 300 meters. So he needs to run only 700 meters. The opposition needs to run 1,000 meters. But there is absolutely no possibility that the opposition could win, because they actually do not compete about 100% of votes, but only about 2/3 of votes. So the opposition needs to win 70% of the remaining amount to win elections. And additionally to this, all the major political parties in Serbia have been leader-centered traditionally, and in the region as well. And in terms of the state, the most important person is always the president of the ruling party. So when you vote in elections, the names of the list for which you vote, there is a proportional system of elections, you don't vote for the party. In the last elections, the ruling party was not even mentioned on ballot papers. It was Aleksandar Vučić for future of our children. So you vote actually for the person. Each party has personification, and the leader is very often mentioned before the party is sometimes not even mentioned. This means that there is a phenomenon in Serbia called movable or portable political power. The president of the party takes political power with himself or herself, no matter where he or she goes. So if the president of the ruling party is the president, he's the most important person. If he's the prime minister, again, he is the most important person. Now, everything that developed caused certain concerns, and rapporteur of the European Parliament for Serbia, David McAllister, said something very important in August 2017. Actually, there was a debate between him and Mr. Vučić in Belgrade. And at press conference, he said that the EU paths of Serbia would depend mainly on the improvement of the rule of law and the fight against corruption. But Mr. Vučić replied to him at that press conference, said, no, Mr. McAllister, you are not right. We know in Serbia, I paraphrase, of course, we know in Serbia what is the most important. It is number 1, the issue of Kosovo, number 2, Serbia-Russia relations, and only number 3, the rule of law. And everything that happened since 2017 proves that actually Mr. Vučić was right and not Mr. McAllister. And the reason is because a specific system appeared in the Western Balkans, in Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and elsewhere. North Macedonia under the previous government of Mr. Gruevski. And it is the so-called system of stabilitocracy. It means that you have a strong leadership who is with strong leadership and a strong leader who has the ability to cope with security and political crisis. That leadership includes fiscal responsibility and full ability to service foreign debts, which became very important to the EU in the wake of the Greek crisis. That leadership promotes business environment, but it also includes populism and identity politics as main political narratives. At the same time, this system of stabilitocracy erodes liberal democracy because it shifts focus from the rule of law to economic reforms only. It centralizes decision-making, and that is a paradox because decentralization at the end of the day will make it ineffective, and it's supposed to be very effective. And it strengthens partitocracy further, but then without partitocracy, there would be no strong leadership that is mutually connected. But this system actually allowed also some results that those governments could use to justify the system. For instance, in Serbia, the record amount of foreign direct investments actually happened in 2018-2019, when Serbia received 7.3 billion euros of foreign direct investments. It also demonstrated good results in the field of building infrastructure, constructing some mega projects, and so on. And even in terms of regional initiatives, for instance, the creation of mini Schengen area is around one of the results of it. This system, as I said, it included Montenegro, Serbia, and North Macedonia, and I will show you now simply to explain how it looks like. I will try to show you one chart. And that chart basically shows democracy scores of Freedom House. 7 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. Everything between 5 and 7 is consolidated democracy. Between 4 and 5 is non-consolidated, and less than 4, that's a magic number, is hybrid or hybrid regime. And if you look into this chart, what happened between 2010 and 2020, you will see that Albania regressed, Montenegro regressed, Serbia as well. Also, North Macedonia, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, now North Macedonia. So the only area that slightly improved is Kosovo, but it had so low results that even this improvement is not as significant as it looks like. And if you take an average, you can see that the whole region basically decreased. And now I come back to the issue. I will skip the issue of the last elections because I'm sure that someone will ask about that, and in Q&A session I can speak about that. It is that the future of liberal opposition in Serbia will remain strongly tied to the Kosovo issue because the EU needs someone who will be able to resolve the Kosovo issue, and inability of successive pro-Western and liberal governments between 2000 and 2012 proved that coalition governments that consisted of various fragments were not able to deliver what the West expected. So essentially, there is still a need for an effective leader in Belgrade, but also other capitals of the Western Balkans. And therefore, I believe that this question of further democratization of Serbia and perhaps also the rest of the region will be very much tied to resolving these issues. This is the map where you can see what is actually the current result, and you can see all these orange countries. They are now countries that are either slightly below the level of non-consolidated democracies or well below the level. And the only addition to that is that also Hungary and Serbia joined the club in the last year. But I must say that those assessments that use a different methodology, which is more favorable for stabilitocracies, so those assessments that use business-related indicators like intelligence unit of The Economist or Bertelsmann's Foundation and some other, they actually still consider Serbia as a non-consolidated democracy. So only in this NIT, Nations in Transit, Serbia was reduced to non-consolidated democracy and partly free country. And here I come to the last point. The EU is a key factor. Without the EU, there can be no real discussion about the future of liberal democracy in the area, because internal impulses have been marginalized. There is incredible moving of especially young people from this region after Bulgaria, which is the most affected. This region is the second most affected. It has been going continually for decades, and it has left dire consequences. So without the EU, it is very difficult to imagine. And on the other hand, the EU wants to resolve this issue of Kosovo. With these 4 candidate countries, 5 with Turkey, you can see that essentially the EU needs to resolve the Kosovo issue, and that is what the EU officials actually said in the last week. They repeated it. Without the EU is also the only foreign actor which is genuinely interested to have liberal democracy in the Balkans. Other actors, I think, including the United States, have more real political approach. So this is now a tricky question: how to have both, and can you have simultaneously improvement of democracy scores and the resolution of the Kosovo issue? I think realistically speaking, it will be very difficult, but I need to say that this same government, which now was ranked as non-consolidated democracy, was ranked as a hybrid regime, was ranked for many years as non-consolidated democracy. So if the EU insisted on that, it would just insist from the same government that already had different ranking to reach that ranking back. But it is more realistic to expect that this issue of democratization and improving all those indicators that you just saw that do not look very good for the whole of the region will be reinstated only after the resolution of the Kosovo issue, and that means perhaps 2022 or later. And unfortunately, only then we could expect that what Mr. McAllister said, that the rule of law would be #1 issue, indeed would become #1 issue in the relations between the European Union and Serbia. And until then, I'm afraid that Serbian democracy will remain a hostage to the resolution of the Kosovo issue.
Slobodan, thank you in turn very much indeed. Before we turn to the question and answer session from our audience, I would just like to remind our participants that if you want to ask a question, could you please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. That way we will be able to answer your questions in turn and fully. Could you also please give a brief question and a brief affiliation so we know who you are and we can refer to you in person? Whilst our participants and audience are thinking about questions, and they are coming in, could I just make 3 very general observations before we move on to tackling other issues? It seems to me that there is a wide variety of explanations for what we're witnessing in Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe today in the context of illiberal democracy. And I know Arkadiusz doesn't really like that term, but if I could just use it for shorthand for the time being, in the context of illiberal democracy or illiberalism, in the context of populism, which are individual characteristics to each of the countries that we've been referring to, but maybe more widespread and shared amongst the countries in the region. And I think that's something which we would come back to later on. What I'd like to say is there may be 3 broad similarities or issues here which may tie the various comments that our panelists have made together. The first, and I think this is where Slobodan ended up on, but it's been a feature of both what Radu and Arkadiusz said, is that in terms of explaining what is happening in Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe today, or the Western Balkans, you really have to think of the relationship between these regions and the European Union. I think this is an intrinsic part of the debate and something that cannot be forgotten or simply swept under the carpet, both for the European Union and for Poland, Romania, Serbia, and all the other countries we're talking about. Why? Well, for 2 specific reasons. One is because there is the issue of democratization and what it means, and how it is achieved. Is this something that can be achieved by conditionality? Is this something that the transformative power of the European Union has in its grasp and is able to share through inducements and punishments, perhaps even to the countries that are becoming members or want to become members or have become members? But also the second dimension of this is the dimension of identity. All three speakers have mentioned identity in one form or another as being an important component or ingredient in what we're seeing today. And the question that comes to mind here is, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a European identity, which harks back to some kind of historical shared understanding of who we are and where we are at and perhaps where we're going? Or is it something specific to the current context of the EU that's at stake and what the EU represents in terms of European identity? So that's one point. The second point in terms of relationship, and this reflects some of the questions that are coming in from our audience, is what is the relationship between the countries of the region in terms of illiberal democracy or authoritarianism? I will come to a specific question from one of our audience members in a second, but there is obviously a relationship here. And we need to be able to explain the differences and the similarities in some kind of regional context to be able to draw meaningful conclusions. And the last point I'd like to make in terms of relationships is perhaps to cast a lot of your comments and ideas and suggestions in terms of a relationship with history. Because again, what we have here is a series of events and transformations within each of the individual countries that you discussed in detail, and perhaps the regional context in which they're found, which are put always in some kind of historical context. We cannot think, of course, about, for example, Poland without thinking about the communist rule in the country and the consequences of that rule and perhaps the collapse of that rule. In the case of Serbia and the former Yugoslavia, as Slobodan emphasized in his presentation, the 1990s is a significant historical context, which in a sense has provided a path by which this kind of illiberalism has grown in that particular part of the world. War, and war resulting in an antithesis with outside powers, outside organizations, and outside actors. And perhaps the most interesting of these is something which we perhaps might want to come back to, is a historical relationship with power, that each of these countries, in a sense, in their regional context in the past, saw themselves as being rather powerful. And what we're seeing now, perhaps, is a relationship with that idea that identity is not merely European identity, but it's Polish or Serbian or Romanian identity in a very specific regional context. So those are just some ideas which perhaps you'd like to address when you're answering the questions of our panelists. And if I could kick off the questions, could I just put to you a question, or I'll paraphrase a question which has been put to us by one of our audience members, John Nguyen, who is an alumnus of the University of London, who, and I paraphrase, asks a question of what are the limits of illiberalism in each of these countries that we've been discussing, or in these regions as a whole? Where does illiberalism end? What are the limits of this illiberalism? How far can it go? And when does the popular will that all of you refer to in one form or another redress this imbalance, if you want, and take back control of what they see as being democracy? Arkadiusz, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure, gladly. Well, it's pretty hard to explain what the future will bring, because it all depends on the situation within the Law and Justice Party. Actually, everything depends on it. We don't know the world in which the Law and Justice Party is not ruled by Mr. Kaczyński. So if we were to judge or think what the future will bring, you have to take into account that the Law and Justice will change after Mr. Kaczyński decides to retire. He's not going to do so anytime soon, but in a couple of years, it's inevitable. So the issue is who will then take control of the Law and Justice. And there are, of course, different fractions waiting for Mr. Kaczyński to step down. So I believe that the future of this party will have a tremendous consequences for the future of democracy in Poland. But I would like to assure you that there are strong sympathies towards liberal democracy and towards let's call it that way, European values in Poland. I'm going to continue my point I've mentioned before, that there's this struggle going on, and I'm not really sure if this illiberal side is winning. Let me give you a couple of examples. Since 1992, the Center for Public Opinion Research, have been asking Poles if they agree with the statement that democracy has an advantage over all other forms of government. And we started with modest results. In 1992, 52% of Poles answered yes. And the record was set in May 2018. 76% responded yes. And the last results are from July this year, 73%. And only 11% disagrees, and 15% has no specified opinion. And we can observe similar results concerning support for the European Union. For example, in 2014, so way before the Law and Justice took power, 47% of Poles declared that membership in the EU does not restrict Poland's sovereignty and independence too much. And 36% had the opposite opinion. Now these numbers stand at 55% and 35%. And I could provide you with a lot of similar results. Overwhelmingly, Poles declare support for democracy, European values, European cooperation, and even tolerance towards homosexuals. The numbers differ, 60%, 70%, but the difference is huge in favor for this, let's call it, progressive standpoint. So here's a conundrum for you. If most Poles declare that they agree with, let's call it that way, European values, then how come Law and Justice won 6 elections in a row? And that brings me to the issue Slobodan brought to our discussion, the issue of switching of focus from the rule of law to simply economic values, to finances. And I believe that in the context of Poland, it's pretty simple. I've prepared a list of key promises of the Law and Justice, and only about half of them materialized in some way. And among those promises are pretty radical ones. And many of them have not been touched at all since 2015. And there are some cases in which they tried to do something, and there are examples in which the promises have been implemented in part. It is a myth that the Law and Justice delivered on the promises significantly better than its predecessors. However, they delivered on the fundamental issue of social transfers. And no other government after 1989 was this eager to redistribute the wealth among the people. And the flagship proposal called 500 plus, 500 zlotys for every child, has changed political landscape. And another crucial change was restoring the 2013 retirement age reform in Poland. In 2016, lower pension age was restored. So to answer your question, I believe there are very strong limitations to this illiberal trend. I don't like this term, but okay, let's stick to it. There are certain limitations which are deeply founded in the public sphere, in the public opinion, in civil society in Poland. So I'd say that the most possible scenario for Poland is simply the more of the same. As of now, we have new initiatives coming up regarding yet another reform of the Supreme Court. So there will be another institutional struggle in Poland, but basically it will be, there won't be any revolution in the sense of changing our government into authoritarian one. There will be some institutional struggle, and people will suffer because of the struggle, because of the issue that this struggle will create more vacuum in the sense of institutions. Institutions won't be able to deliver. So I believe there are strong limitations to what the Law and Justice could actually achieve in this trend.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to turn to Radu now to say, from his point of view, what he thinks the limits of illiberal democracy may be in Romania or through the region as a whole, because it seems to me that populism in the sense of social transfers is a very potent electoral winning weapon, And this is something which may or may not have limits, but this is what we need to focus on, perhaps. Radu.
Absolutely, because we did not join Euro, and we question, the economic civil society questions the reasons why this was not made. Not joining the Euro means a mean for the government to control the value of the currency, the level of the wages, and to transfer more wealth from one side of the society to the other based on context, and of course, and of electoral interest. Now, the question is, I fully understand why Arkadiusz does not like the word illiberal. Viktor Orban himself did not define it. When I first heard it, I thought, I told myself that maybe the word illiberal would be better. Why? Because it is not illiberal per se. It does not fully contest liberalism as economy and open society. It targets just some areas where liberalism seems to change society in a way that does not match the interest of a certain group. It can be religious, it can be political, it can be social. It is also manipulable. That's the interesting part, because more you speculate on it, more modular it becomes, and it suits more interests. However, nobody dropped or rejects the principles of free market and of, classic capitalism, to put it like that. So we still play with it. What governments do is handle the redistribution of wealth, which, and this is exactly what I saw. The ingredients are the same. What differs is the amount you put in the recipe to govern. But in Romania, we don't like a-liberalism or illiberalism, not just because we lived in it, but because even the speech that was supposed to deliver it or to enroot it in our society, which is an anti-European speech, which was promoted at certain moments in the last couple of years, is not catching. It's not catching because we don't see Romanian politicians or Romanian institutions as being able to deliver good governance going against the European Union. We trust more the European institutions than we trust our own national institutions. So the attachment to the ideas of democracy and good governance is reflected in an attachment to the European institutions. And we would rather question the honesty of the national institutions rather than the European ones. And I put this in contrast with what was happening in Poland and Hungary, when the political speech was often insisting on the fact that Polish and Hungarian institutions can do better than the European ones, given the fact that the European ones have their own agenda, which is not matching the national interest. This, for instance, didn't work in Romania, and will not work because in time, this gradual awakening of the civil society made it possible for the NGOs, for the for various platforms, civic platforms, to actually start to work with other actors that suffer the pressure of hectic governance based on a-liberal or illiberal principles. That is mainly the business milieu, so the private sector. And we have what I would call an alliance between the civil society and the private sector to put pressure on the government in ways that keep it focusing on what is European and what is perceived as European. By that, we mean good governance, open society, functional democracy, and more exigence. So it's not this, but it's a process. The problem is how much time it takes, and this is exactly what started to startle us. We actually need an entire generation. Relating this to the historical perspective, we do need an entire generation to process the meaning of open society, functional democracy, and free market, truly free market.
Radu, thank you very much. Slobodan, would you like to take on this this question of what are the limits of illiberal democracy, or whichever other phrase you want to use to replace that? What is your thinking on this?
Well, first of all, let me say that in terms of free market, all these stabilitocracies are very dedicated to free market. And actually, most of international financial institutions like them exactly because of that. At one press conference with, I think with German, someone from Germany, Mr. Vucic boosted, he said, look, we service our debt very, very precisely, unlike the Greek government. That was when Varoufakis was in charge of Greek finances. So those stabilitocracies, they are really committed to free market, to certain market reforms, and to the issue of GDP growth. And this brings us back to what Arkadiusz has just raised. How does the electorate react to that? What would the electorate say if they are to choose between more of the rule of law or higher salaries? What would they say? And I think they will probably opt for higher salaries. And even now, what's going to happen in short terms, Serbia apparently will have one of the lowest GDP decline in Europe this year, probably around minus 2.5%. So again, the government will be able to say, look, this is the result of our stability. And certainly electorate will appreciate that. And the reason why the previous government actually lost support is that it was able to generate growth. But that growth has been, in the meantime, baptized by economists as jobless growth. In the period 2000-2008, GDP went up, but no new jobs were created. But obviously, this economic factor is very important for the future of liberal democracy. What worries me, to a certain degree, is a new phenomenon, and that is the rise of illiberal civil society. So suddenly, a myriad of small associations have appeared, dealing with heritage issues, similar issues. It's not that they are not part of the civil society, but this is also concomitant with that. But there is another issue. In Serbia, value axis has been rather stable for 30 years. 70% of population is conservative, 65 to 70, and about 30% is liberal. So again, this is something that basically gives legitimacy to stabilitocracy more than to all those advocates of liberal democracy. So essentially, liberal democracy is confined to basically academic circles, very small political parties, and the middle class, actually only one part of the middle class. And what worries me particularly is that very recently in some surveys, the main gainers in the past several years in Serbia have been people working in IT sector. It's the fastest growing sector in Serbia, and they have the highest salaries. And they were asked, if you were to choose between having high salaries or complaining about the situation with the rule of law, what would you select? And they clearly said, we would select high salaries. So coalition of those who would be in for liberal democracy is very seriously undermined in Serbia and in the region. And without the EU insisting on that, it will be further undermined.
Okay, thank you very much, Slobodan. Let's go to a slightly different issue. I'm going to collapse together two questions which have been put by members of our audience. And again, please excuse me if I paraphrase some of these questions, but the gist of the question remains the same. The first of these questions comes from Turkey, from Kadir Güler, who asks, do authoritarian leaders in the region copy each other? Do they mimic each other? Is there some kind of process by which a snowball effect exists in the region? And attached to this, there is a question which, again, I'm paraphrasing, put by Bianca Swalem, who's an author and an alumnus of the LSE, who says, what is the reaction of the countries that we've been discussing with respect to perhaps the situation in the Ukraine over the last few years, or the current situation in Belarus? How are they reacting to these processes of, if you want, democratization or stalled democratization that have been taking place. So 2 questions, one of mimicking, copying, and one of Belarus and Ukraine, and what are the implications here? Radu, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. I was thinking about that because ultimately I was mentioning Victor Ponta imitating Erdogan and Liviu Dragnea imitating Viktor Orban, but we should go at who started it? And what popped in my mind was a formula of Adam Michnik during a conference in Cluj organized by the Radu Democracy Center, where he talked about the little Putins. Actually, Putin was the original model. And the model of, I will give you economic benefits, you, the citizens, and you shall give me your freedom and the most possible power in the state to govern. I think this was a trade that sounded tempting for those who wanted to better control societies, either for the interest, of their political parties or private interest, or for the sake of an idea they had about the national destiny. It happens. Mm-hmm. So I think we can go back to that specific decade of the first decade of this century, where we've seen Putin, which was a different kind of Putin back then, more open to a dialogue with the West, offering a model that was copied. And I remember Adam Michnik mentioning, well, of course, the Kaczynskis as being the first who imitated, which is a paradox ultimately. But we had also Băsescu. Băsescu in Romania was such a figure because in the end, he presided over the destinies of this country for 9 years. It was quite a long term, while nothing can be held against him in terms of foreign affairs. He anchored Romania in the Atlantic world. In terms of political behavior on the domestic scene, well, he was a bully. We can definitely define him as such, by forcing institutions, by forcing the constitution, by using the majority in the parliament to practice a policy that was actually close to what he was accusing his rivals, the Social Democrats, of practicing. So, which was controlling legislation, controlling massively the state institution, and using anti-corruption as a way to clean the political scene from his opponents and cut them off. So we went through that. And this is why I was saying that Romanians still remember, but not strongly enough, I'm afraid. We will have elections this year in November. And I'm curious if memories from the past, soothed a bit by the increase in wages and by a better economic living standard compared to what was going on in Romania 10 years ago, will that actually impact negatively on the political reasoning of the Romanian electorate or not? Will we make a choice that keeps us in an area where we have, for instance, today, a liberal president and a liberal parliament? Or will it keep Romania in this area of confusion and conflict between a parliament that is dominated by the Social Democrats, like today, and a president that is a liberal and would like to see Romania more democratic and more converging actually with the core of the European Union? So yeah, well, yet again, debates.
Okay, thank you very much, Radu. Slobodan, over to you. Would you like to say something about the particular issue of mimicking, copying, or perhaps about Belarus and Ukraine?
Well, about Belarus and Ukraine, there is a specific situation in Serbia related again to the Kosovo issue and the fact that Russia became an important regional player present, having its own media actually in Serbia, like Sputnik, Russia Today, and other media. So Serbian media were much less critical of Lukashenko generally than other media in Central and Southeast Europe, and also were not as enthusiastic about the Orange Revolution in Ukraine as others were, and that is specifically related to the fact that Russian narratives have had certain influence in the past. Of course, what's very striking is that the situation changed dramatically in the last several weeks, and for the first time, Serbia actually officially joined the EU in condemning the elections in Belarus. Regarding copying other models, I would agree that Putin was the arch model for everyone, and all the others, of course, may also copy. Vučić himself is a very good friend of Orban, and Orban is a very good friend of him. So undoubtedly, it's not necessarily something negative, because it improved the Serbian-Hungarian relations very much. And at least with one neighbor, Serbia has excellent relations. And even in recent, Greece is the most popular country traditionally in Serbia, but now Hungary is among top 5 countries in terms of popularity. That is something very new. Usually it would be Romania, still Romania is there, but Hungary is also there. So basically, yes, there is the influence, but Putin is the arch model, I think, to everyone.
Thank you, Slobodan. Arkadiusz, is there something you'd like to say on the topic of mimicking?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I'm not sure. Actually, I am sure. I wouldn't put Jarosław Kaczyński in the same category as Putin or Erdogan, and I wouldn't seek for any inspiration in this area. However, I find very obvious inspiration, and of course, it's Viktor Orban. And even Mr. Kaczyński has famously stated in October 2011 that there will be a day when there will be a Budapest in Warsaw. Of course, he meant that the law and justice will try to win as spectacularly as Fidesz did in 2010. And there has been a lot of talk about Viktor Orban in recent years in Poland. And I think that this inspiration is very clear, and it has been brought up many times. And the law and justice in some way tries to be another Fidesz, but the situation is different, the environment is different. So I'll say that it's a loose inspiration and not a direct copy of the party. And when it comes to the other issue, the east of Europe, then Poland, of course, was and is very active in the area. When it comes to Belarus, then, for example, a couple of people who were sort of exiled after the protests broke out found shelter in Poland. We have managed to create some small fund, I believe it's a couple of million euros, for students from Belarus to come to Poland to study. And of course, there's this institutional support which we have been providing for the people of Belarus for years. And I'm talking, of course, about independent, financed by Polish officials, a television called Belsat. And protesters clearly stated what a huge help was to have this sort of independent from the government media, just to inform about what's happening. So, and the same goes with the Ukraine. Polish government tried and still tries to be active in the area, but we have to remember that to be truly effective in helping Ukraine, you have to do it through the European Union. So now this road is kind of blocked due to Article 7 and various different confrontations between Polish government and the Brussels. But I would like to stress one thing very clearly. The cooperation and the support that the Polish government has for Ukrainian and Belarusian people is one of a few examples of consensus among Polish politicians, among the Polish parties. Because it doesn't matter who rules in Warsaw, there are always these sympathies towards Belarus and Ukraine. And this consensus has never been broken after 1989. And I hope it will stay this way, but we have to remember that there are other parties which are not yet in power, but they have different opinions on the issue. And I'm talking, of course, about the Confederacy Party. The rule of this party, well, not they won't get majority, I'm sure, but I can easily see that sometime in the future they could be a junior coalition party. So the coming of this party into power will bring, I believe, some changes in the directories of the foreign policy of Poland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arkadiusz. We are rapidly running out of time, and I've still got a few questions here that have been put by the members of the audience. Let me just ask you two final questions. I've condensed some of the questions from various audience participants to try and get as much exposure as possible. One straightforward question is, what is the role of religion in the process of a liberal democracy, or is there a future for religion in liberal democracy at all? This is a question which has been placed by Plamen Nanov, who's a sociologist at the University of Plovdiv. You may want to answer that question. A bigger question is perhaps a more abstract question or theoretical question, and that is to do with the concept of the end of history. This was something which emerged in the consequences of the collapse of communism. Francis Fukuyama coined this term and used it to explain the great changes that were taking place across the eastern part of Europe in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Are we witnessing the end of history? This is a question which is paraphrased from Neven Andelich's question from the Regent's University of London. Or is illiberal democracy and populism very contextual? Is it a reaction to austerity? Is it a reaction to immigration problems? Is it a reaction to pandemic? Is it very context specific and we don't need to think about it in terms of the end of history? If you could answer in a couple of minutes each any of those parts of the questions, I'd be very, very grateful. And why don't we start with you, Slobodan, on this occasion?
Okay, I'll start with the religion. So, well, if we take the United States of America as a classical example of a liberal democracy, religion plays, as we know, a huge role there. Not necessarily the one that endorses liberal democracy itself, but it is obvious that very strong religious beliefs and liberal democracy can mutually survive one another. There are no indications that the level of religious commitment in the United States would go down at all, and we see in the behavior of presidential candidates since the time when George Bush Jr. won how huge importance religion plays. In regional context, there are quite different examples from two countries where religion is rather stronger than in other countries of Europe. These are Greece and Romania, to Serbia, which is very close to them, and for instance Bulgaria, where religion plays almost no role, or Albania. There are quite different levels of religious commitment in those countries, but it doesn't seem to affect liberal democracy very much. In terms of the end of history, I think it is contextual. I hope it is contextual. I'm not sure, because and it is related to the question of austerity measures, economic crisis. But I think also that it is connected to the issue of redistribution And it is quite obvious that if Bernie Sanders was so close to win the nomination, that the issue of redistribution is something that will Biden, if he will have to deal with. So that is what's going on to be the main issue. And I think that if Biden wins, we will stop speaking about the end of history.
Thank you very much, Slobodan. Arkadiusz, do you have anything to add to the idea of the end of history or the question of religion?
Sure. About the end of the history. Well, I don't like those comparisons between, for example, current situation and situation in the 30s or situation in the 90s. There was a question like this in the list. I think that the history doesn't repeat itself. It echoes, it rhymes. And I believe there are phases in the history. And currently we are facing very complicated problems regarding the very core of democracy, like the ability to have a rational debate, like the rule of law, civic liberties, etc. But I believe, and I want to believe, let's put it that way, that it's just a passing phase. And there will be some sort of new beginning after a couple of years. Of course, I don't think that it is possible to simply go back to what was before, to this giant optimism of 1990s. I believe that this will be a new world with new democratic institutions. But I think that we will see the end of this period in some time, perhaps in a couple of decades. As for religion thing, in Poland, the Catholic Church is divided as everyone else. So of course there are groups which are supporting the ruling parties, and there are those who support the opposition. As of now, currently, there has been many very strong statements from the representatives of the Catholic Church regarding, for example, LGBT. We have this giant discussion in Poland going on about so-called LGBT ideology. Of course, as you know, there is no such thing, but still people discuss it. And the church also takes part in this debate, of course, seeing danger in those ideas coming to Poland. Not everyone in the church thinks that, of course, as I said before, people are divided, but I think that the support of the, I'd call it, majority of the church is something which really favors the law and justice. So I'd say that Catholic Church will have a huge role to play in the coming years when it comes to the state of our democracy, but I won't try to guess in which direction they will go. Thank you.
Arkadiusz, thank you very much. Radu, over to you for the last bit of this question sequence. In 3 minutes, could you please give us your answers? Thank you very much.
I was always, I never trusted the expression itself, end of history, which is good for marketing a book, but it's never real. It's never real because by very nature, by human nature, we keep moving, keep adapting, keep creating. Dynamics are always there. So even the end of history is a part of history, and there is no end. As simple as that. I never trusted it. So I largely ignored the concept. And I never asked my students to focus on it on the first place. Now, in what concerns the role of the church, church is used as an instrument of political influence in Romania, especially by the Social Democrat Party. Now, in theory, Romania has an almost French secular approach of politics and of church and state. But it's not always applied because in terms of electoral influence, you would have priests, you would have movements that can impact on politics and that can impact on society. And this was used a couple of times, especially in the last years, when we have seen, for instance, the involvement of various fringes of the pro-church sympathizers in a referendum that was supposed to define, to introduce in the constitution the definition of the traditional family versus the new European one, because the anti-Europe speech was present. What else? You would also have, for instance, an attempt in gaining sympathy of the conservative electorate by supporting the church or by granting public funds to immense buildings like the so-called Church of the Resurrection of the Nation, which is being built in Bucharest and next to the parliament headquarters. So yes, it is used as an instrument. It has an appeal on the conservative electorate, but I would have to underline one thing. In the last 10 years, because of the economic crisis that hit Romania, church lost much of it, of the sympathy, trust, and support it enjoyed, but it fell from 90% to 60%. It's still a lot, especially in a country where we have a secular approach to politics. But they're there, and they can somehow influence, not impact strongly, but still influence political ideologies, at least at a general level, you know.
Great, thank you very much. I think in the last hour and a half, we've covered an immense amount of ground, both relating to each of the individual countries you were talking about, plus the region as a whole. And I think we should in the future attempt to revisit some of these topics of discussion in certain different formats. Before we go off air, I'd just like to thank firstly, and perhaps most importantly, our audience for logging on and tuning in today and participating in this discussion through questions which I think were useful in terms of pushing debate forward. I'd like to, of course, thank the Radu Democracy Center for sponsoring this event, and we do really hope that we can have future events in terms of the Dialogue and Democracy series, both online and in person in the months to come. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our three speakers, Arkadiusz Nyzio, Radu Albu-Comănescu, and Slobodan Markovich, for taking their time to share their thoughts and ideas with us this afternoon. Thank you all very much, and hope to see you very soon in the future.